My husband made me sign a prenup to protect his stocks. I laughed and signed. For years later, he sneered, "What would you even do without me?" I pointed to the building we just walked out of, "That's my name on it." His friends looked at him like he was nothing. It started in Seattle, where dreams either grow in glass towers or die in the drizzle. When I met Alden, I was 29, working 12-hour shifts at a mid-sized cybersecurity firm just off Union Street. I was the girl in flats, eating from a mason jar and skipping happy hour to debug a firewall breach. I was comfortable being invisible in a city full of tech bros and digital gold rushes. Alden was not invisible. He walked into every room like it was already his. He was 5 years older, with custom-tailored suits and that kind of arrogant, unbothered calm people mistake for genius. He wasn't famous, but in tech circles, people knew him, an early investor in 2 startups that got acquired and one that was about to IPO. We met at a housewarming for someone I barely knew. I was hovering near the bar, half hoping no one would talk to me, when he offered me a drink I'd never heard of and started asking questions about my work. Real questions, not just "so what do you do?" fluff. I didn't realize until later that it wasn't curiosity, it was vetting. He liked puzzles, and I was one he hadn't solved yet. We started dating fast, like stepping on a moving escalator. Within 3 months, he'd flown me to Tokyo, added me to his Amex Platinum, and started talking about our future. It was intoxicating. And a little alarming. When he proposed, it was less a question and more a transaction. He slid the ring across the kitchen counter like a signed term sheet. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "There's something I need you to sign," he said casually. It was a prenup. A thick one. To protect his stocks, he said. And a few other investments. I remember laughing, not because I found it funny, but because it was the only way to keep from feeling insulted. He handed me a pen like he was handing off paperwork to legal. I glanced through it. It was thorough. BRTAL, even. Everything he'd built, he'd keep. Anything we built together might be negotiable, but only if it wasn't tied to his pre-existing portfolio. I signed without hesitation. He seemed pleased. "If I ever leave," I joked, "I'll just take your dog and your espresso machine." He didn't laugh. He never really laughed at my jokes. We got married at a vineyard outside Napa. Small, private, expensive. The kind of wedding where the guest list was more LinkedIn than family tree. My parents didn't come. They said they couldn't afford the flight, but I think the truth was harder than that. My mother had always been wary of men like Alden. "He looks at people like their business plans," she once said. I brushed it off. She didn't understand ambition. Marriage to Alden was efficient. He made decisions quickly and expected the same from me. We had a calendar for everything: grocery shopping, intimacy, date nights. He liked structure. Predictability. Control. He was generous, but always in a way that reminded you who the provider was. When he bought me a car, he told me the monthly depreciation cost like it was a fun fact. When we went on vacation, he itemized our meals in his head. But I wasn't idle. 6 months after we married, I quietly launched a small tech consultancy from our guest room. I called it Kira Logic, after my mother. At first, it was a side project, something to feel productive while Alden traveled and networked. He didn't take it seriously. "That's cute," he said when I showed him my first client's website. "Try not to get distracted by it." He said it with a smirk, the way someone might talk to a toddler stacking blocks. I nodded. Then I went to work. I learned to build. To hire. To manage. I read contracts at 2 a.m., answered support tickets myself, and poured everything into the company. No outside funding. No debt. Just me and the team I built. By the end of year 2, we had an office in Bellevue. Small, but real. My team had grown from 4 to 16. We weren't flashy, but we were reliable, and word was spreading. Alden barely noticed. Or maybe he chose not to. I kept our finances separate. The prenup ensured it. Logic was mine, sole proprietorship, clean books, and eventually, an S-corp. I never asked Alden for a dime. He never offered. Then, we landed a major contract. A biotech company out of Redmond needed a data compliance solution for HIPAA-sensitive platforms. We built a prototype in 3 weeks. The pilot went so well, they asked to license it. Within 4 months, we had 3 more companies lined up to use it. Revenue doubled. Then tripled. I started hiring faster, opening a second office, bringing in legal counsel. We became known in the local startup scene, not flashy like Alden's ventures, but solid, scalable, and smart. Then came the gala. It was one of his events. A fancy fundraiser for one of his newer startups. I didn't want to go. I had a pitch deck to review and a call with a Toronto firm in the morning. But he insisted. Said it was important I show face. So I went. The room was full of men in suits talking about burn rates and exit strategies. Alden gave a speech. People clapped. His name was all over the brochures. As we walked out of the building, still high on his own applause, he looked at me and said it. Half under his breath. Like it was just a fact. What would you even do without me? I didn't answer right away. We had paused at a crosswalk. Across the street stood a new building, sleek glass, chrome accents. My company had just moved into the top 2 floors. The signage had gone up a few days earlier. Logic. Backlit. Bold. My name gleamed like armor. I pointed to it. That's mine. He blinked, like he hadn't noticed it until that moment. Like he couldn't process that the building across the street was not just a building, it was proof. His friends, 3 guys in sharp suits, always hovering nearby, followed my finger. One of them, the youngest, raised his eyebrows. That's your company? I nodded. We just signed a $30 million licensing agreement with MedGen. None of them spoke after that. Alden looked like someone had knocked the wind out of him. I watched it hit him, not the success, but the fact that it had happened without him. He didn't say a word on the drive home. The silence was heavier than any fight we'd ever had. The next morning, I came down to the kitchen to find the prenup on the table. He was sitting there, coffee in hand, looking like he'd stayed up all night. He tapped the document. This protects me. I nodded. It does. He narrowed his eyes. And what protects you? I poured myself some coffee. Me. He didn't get it. Or maybe he did, and that's what scared him. He started digging. Asking questions. Pulling legal documents. Trying to find the flaw in my structure. The chink in the armor. But there wasn't one. The company was mine. The IP was mine. The profits went through a family trust I'd established before we married, one that listed my mother as the primary beneficiary. He wasn't entitled to a dime. I hadn't hidden anything. I'd just built carefully. Quietly. Like a woman who knew she might need an exit plan someday. He stopped trying to talk me out of it after that. The prenup that had once made him feel invincible now felt like a wall closing in. He'd signed away any claim to what I was building. And worse, he was realizing that I had never needed his money. Or his guidance. Or his approval. After that morning in the kitchen, the dynamic in our marriage shifted dramatically. The balance tipped, and he didn't know how to exist in the new arrangement. Alden had always been the one in control. He thrived on being the expert, the provider, the man with the plan. And now here I was, the quiet, agreeable wife who had apparently outgrown the role he'd written for me. He became unpredictable. Cold one day, overly attentive the next. He started showing up to my office unannounced, asking strange questions about my employees, asking who I was meeting with. I'd catch him reading emails over my shoulder, making passive comments about my schedule. Another late night, he'd ask, pretending to joke. I'd smile politely, some of us still work for a living. He hated that. Hated that I no longer asked for his advice. That I had people who depended on me now. That I could walk into a room and command the same kind of attention he used to get, not because of who I was married to, but because of what I'd done. I think it really sunk in when I made the Forbes local entrepreneurs list. It wasn't even the cover, just a side feature on promising tech founders in the Northwest. I didn't tell him about it. I didn't have to. Someone texted him a screenshot before I even got home. He was sitting in the living room with the magazine open on the coffee table when I walked in. He didn't look angry. He looked bewildered. "You didn't even mention this?" he asked. I shrugged, kicked off my shoes. "Didn't think you'd be interested." "You're in Forbes, Ava." "Yeah. Small piece. Not a big deal." He stared at me. "Do you even know how rare that is?" I poured a glass of wine and sat down across from him. "I do." We didn't talk for the rest of the night. Things got worse before they got better. He began nitpicking everything. If I missed a dinner reservation, he'd accuse me of being disrespectful. If I answered a late-night Slack message, he'd say I was addicted to work. If I didn't want to go to one of his networking events, he'd guilt-trip me for not supporting him. But it wasn't about support. It was about control. He was flailing, trying to grab onto any piece of leverage he had left. But I wasn't the same woman he married. I wasn't building a company for fun anymore. I was building a legacy. And I wasn't going to shrink myself to make room for his ego. The real breaking point came during a dinner party we hosted at our condo. He'd invited a group of friends from San Francisco, VCs, product managers, a few founders he was trying to get in good with. I agreed, mostly for appearances. The evening started off fine. Small talk, cocktails, expensive charcuterie boards. I mingled like I was supposed to. Then one of his guests, a guy named Jonah, started asking me about Logic. "So, you're the one behind all the data compliance stuff, huh?" he said. "That's blowing up. I've heard MedGen is making bank off your platform." I nodded. "They're doing pretty well with it, yeah. Are you guys planning on spinning off? Or is Alden keeping it in-house?" I blinked. "Alden's not involved." Jonah looked confused. "Wait, seriously?" I just assumed. That's when Alden cut in, laughing a little too hard. "She likes to pretend I don't exist when it comes to business," he said, brushing it off like it was a joke. Jonah didn't laugh. I didn't either. "She's the CEO," Jonah said quietly. "That's hers." The room went uncomfortably quiet for a few seconds. Alden tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. Every person in that room now knew the truth. Alden wasn't the empire builder anymore. I was. That night, he picked a fight after everyone left. Accused me of embarrassing him. Said I'd made him look like a tag-along husband. "You couldn't just let me have the spotlight for one night?" I stared at him. "You had it for years." He looked like he wanted to yell, but the words never came. Instead, he stormed into the guest room and slammed the door. The next morning, I went into the office early. I had too much to do, and frankly, I needed the distance. My assistant, Brenna, handed me a message from our legal team. The patent filings for our new encryption tool had gone through. Our valuation had jumped overnight. By the end of the week, 3 investors had reached out. One of them offered a buyout. 8 figures. I declined. Logic wasn't for sale. Not yet. When I came home that Friday night, Alden was sitting on the couch in silence. The prenup was back on the table. Again. He didn't look smug this time. He looked scared. "We should talk," he said quietly. "I don't think talking is going to help." He nodded slowly. "You're leaving me, aren't you?" I didn't answer. Not right away. Because part of me still remembered who he was at the beginning. the man who'd swept me off my feet. The one who made me feel like I was stepping into something bigger than myself. But the truth was, I had. Just not in the way he thought. I had built something bigger than the marriage. Bigger than him. And I had done it quietly, methodically, and entirely on my own. He had wanted a partnership on paper, but in practice, he'd only ever wanted a subordinate. And I had outgrown that role. I didn't answer him that night. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. And once I said it out loud, there was no going back. Instead, I sat across from him in silence. The air between us felt brittle. Like the marriage itself had become a structure of glass. Too pristine to touch, too fragile to stand on. He looked tired. Not physically, but deeply, internally worn. Like someone who'd woken up in a life they no longer recognized. Or controlled. He asked again, softer this time. "Ava, are you leaving?" And again, I said nothing. Because truthfully, I already had. Not physically, yet. But emotionally, mentally, professionally, I'd left a long time ago. I had simply never announced my departure. That weekend, we didn't speak much. We moved around the condo like two ghosts haunting the same space. We shared a kitchen, but not meals. Shared a bed, but not warmth. Everything was muted. Measured. And then, on Tuesday, I saw the email. Alden had forwarded something to our financial advisor, someone I rarely interacted with directly. But somehow, he'd CC'd me on the thread by mistake. Or maybe not by mistake. Maybe it was a final attempt at leverage. The email discussed transferring assets. His assets. He was exploring ways to restructure his holdings in anticipation of potential marital changes. He didn't mention me by name, but it didn't take a genius to read between the lines. He was moving pieces around, preparing for a divorce like it was a boardroom breakup. Always planning. Always 5 steps ahead. I stared at the email for a long time. Not out of anger, but disappointment. Not because he was preparing to protect himself, but because I realized he'd never once considered that I didn't need to play the same game. He was still working under the assumption that this was a negotiation. That there were cards left to play. But I wasn't bluffing. I replied to the thread, CCING only our lawyers, please include me in future discussions related to the dissolution of our shared assets. Though minimal, I'd like to ensure this process remains civil and transparent. I'll have my team follow up. Within an hour, I got a call from him. You really think this is how we should handle it? Professionally? Yes, I said. This is a business arrangement, remember? He didn't respond right away. When he did, he tried one more time. Ava, we could fix this. Maybe we just need time. We had time, I said gently. You just spent it trying to stay ahead of me. The weeks that followed were strangely calm. No screaming, no drawn-out fights. Just paperwork and silence. We continued to live under the same roof, though barely speaking. It was like we were coworkers finishing out the final days of a project we no longer cared about. I went to work early. Stayed late. I poured every ounce of emotion into scaling Curologic. My team could feel it too, something had shifted. I was sharper. More focused. More decisive. They didn't know what was happening in my personal life, but they felt the current change. And they rose with me. My top engineer proposed a new tool that would streamline clinical trial data in half the time. My ops manager landed a deal with a European firm. My junior PM closed her first solo pitch with a Fortune 500. The machine was running. And I had become something I'd never expected, a leader who inspired people by example, not by volume. The divorce proceedings began without drama. The prenup, which had once made Alden feel secure, now worked against him in ways he hadn't imagined. There was nothing for him to take. No claim he could make. My assets were separate. My company was airtight. Even the condo, technically, was mine. I'd used my earnings to pay off the mortgage in full last year. He never even noticed. Never bothered to ask. Our lawyers coordinated most of it. The only real conversation we had in person during the legal process happened on a rainy Thursday, inside our now half-empty living room. "I just never thought it'd end like this," he said, staring out the window. I didn't know what to say. So I said the one thing I hadn't allowed myself to admit out loud before: I didn't either. But I also didn't think I'd outgrow you. He turned, slowly, like he wasn't sure he'd heard me right. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I said it calmly, with no heat behind it. Just truth. "I thought we'd grow together," I added. "But you didn't want a partner. You wanted a follower. Someone who stayed small enough to orbit you." "I never tried to keep you small," he said quietly. "You didn't have to try," I said. "You just assumed I'd stay there." That silence again. The kind that fills the spaces where love used to live. He nodded. "Just once." Then he walked out of the room. I moved out 2 weeks later. Took only what was mine: clothes, books, a few pieces of furniture that had sentimental value. Everything else, I left behind. The condo felt like a museum of someone else's life. I rented a brownstone in Capitol Hill. Nothing fancy. Just warm, quiet, and mine. I filled it with plants and art and noise. My noise. Jazz records, old vinyls, spontaneous late-night phone calls with friends. The hum of my own thoughts. I thought I'd feel free. Or triumphant. I didn't. Not right away. What I felt was peace. A strange, heavy kind. Like the weight of having to prove myself had been lifted. Like I no longer had to apologize for being big. Logic continued to grow. Our platform launched in 3 more countries. We entered a partnership with the University of British Columbia. I started mentoring young women in tech, telling them everything I'd wished someone had told me at 29. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about Alden. Not in anger. Not in bitterness. Just, not at all. He became a chapter in a story I no longer needed to reread. But then something happened. About 6 months after the divorce finalized, I got an invitation to speak at a panel in downtown Seattle. The topic was women building the future of tech. It was sponsored by a local VC group, one I knew Alden had ties to. I debated saying no. But then I thought, why not? I had nothing to prove. The panel was packed. The room filled with familiar faces: founders, engineers, journalists. And yes, Alden was there, in the back, standing near the exit. He didn't approach me. Didn't wave. But he watched. I gave my talk. Told the story, not about him, but about what it took to build something while carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. I spoke plainly. Without shame. Without anger. When the panel ended, people clapped. A few came up to shake my hand. Alden didn't. He left before I stepped off the stage. But that night, I got an email. Subject line: "I finally understand." I didn't open it. Because I didn't need him to understand. I had finally understood myself. I didn't open the email that night. Or the next day. In fact, I never opened it at all. I left it sitting in my inbox like a fossil, proof that something had once existed, but no longer lived. There was nothing Alden could say in a paragraph or even 1,000 words that would shift anything in me now. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. But because I had already moved past needing his understanding. And honestly, part of me felt that letting the email sit there, unread, was the most fitting response of all. Because Alden always needed to be heard. Acknowledged. Recognized. So I gave him silence. A year passed. And with it, so did the remnants of that life. Logic reached a level I'd never imagined. We finalized a partnership with the Mayo Clinic. Our compliance platform became the standard across 5 major hospital networks. I was no longer up and coming. I had arrived. And for the first time, I stopped operating from survival mode. I stopped building to prove something. I started building because I could. I started to speak more publicly. Did panels, podcasts, wrote a few essays. Not about Alden. I never named him. That wasn't the revenge I was after. I wasn't interested in destroying him. I was interested in making him irrelevant. He'd become background noise. A prelude. The spark that lit the fire but couldn't contain it. The actual revenge? That came later. And it came quietly. It was during a private networking event in Palo Alto. Not a flashy conference. Just a closed door, founders-only kind of gathering where people traded intel and investor gossip over single malt and shrimp skewers. I was standing near a white marble bar when I overheard someone talking about a pitch deck they'd received from a washed-up Seattle guy trying to get a crypto security startup off the ground. I turned slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to hear. He had some early wins, but honestly? Nothing recent. He listed a bunch of advisory roles, but no real traction. I didn't hear the name. But I didn't need to. I knew. I sipped my drink, smiled politely, and walked away. Then came the moment that brought everything full circle. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even planned. I was asked to attend a business luncheon back in Seattle, a ribbon-cutting event for a tech accelerator I'd invested in through one of my philanthropic funds. Logic was listed as a community innovation partner, which basically meant I donated a lot of money and helped design their Women in Tech mentorship model. The event was at the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. A sleek building with a rooftop garden and sweeping views of the Sound. The type of place people wore name tags even though everyone already knew who everyone was. I was walking out of the building after giving a short thank you speech, chatting with a group of young founders, when I saw him. Alden. Standing by a pillar, talking to a VC I happened to know. He looked the same, but somehow smaller. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. His suit was still expensive. His shoes still polished. But his presence? Dull. Like a car that used to turn heads, now just another sedan in a parking lot full of Teslas. He saw me. Of course he did. And he approached. His pace wasn't confident anymore. It was careful. Hesitant. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, pleasantly. We made small talk. Shallow, harmless, bland. I told him things were good. He said he was working on a few projects. I didn't ask for details. He didn't offer them. But then, just as I turned to leave, he said something I'll never forget. "I heard about the Toronto deal," he said. "Logic's valuation must be insane now." I nodded, coolly. "It's been a good year." He smiled. That same smirk he used to wear like armor. But this time, it didn't land. "It's funny," he said. "I still remember you signing that prenup like it was nothing." I tilted my head. Because it was nothing. And then I gestured, without drama, toward the banner that had just been hung above the main entrance of the building. Proudly sponsored by Logic. Large. Elegant. And just below it, in smaller but unmistakable print, founded by Ava Sinclair. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I watched his eyes track the sign. Watched the weight of it settle over him like fog. He blinked, once. Then again. His VC friend came over just then, smiling, shaking my hand, thanking me for my contribution. Alden stood there, silent. No longer the center of the room. Not even close. And in that moment, I realized this was the revenge. Not because he was suffering. But because I wasn't. Because I had become untouchable to the version of him that once thought I was disposable. Because he had tried to clip my wings before I ever learned I could fly, And now I soared so far above him that all he could do was look up. So no, I didn't ruin him. I didn't destroy his life. I didn't drag him through the mud. I just became a woman he would never, ever have access to again. And that was enough. That was everything.